So up first, the first paper we have is Robert Edwards, who postdoc at University of Notre Dame, and his paper is The School of Antioch, School of Thought or Monastic Institution. I'm not quite sure how the best way is going to be on this, but I'm going to try doing the raise hand reaction when you get, say, 3 minutes left, and then if you get down to 1, I'll just start like this, and then I think I can mute you / kick you / do something drastic if you're hit your 20-minute mark. All right.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. And I'll say first of all that my paper here today is the beginning of a larger work on thinking about how we can speak about the School of Antioch in sort of more robust ways than we have in the past. And so today what I'm going to do is offer some perspective on why we speak about the School of Antioch and Antiochian Christianity in late antiquity more broadly, and then offer briefly some ways forward. Okay. In scholarly narratives of late antiquity, all roads lead to Antioch, or at least there's a great continental divide on either side of which all manner of historical persons, theological doctrines, or exegetical tendencies flow either on one side to Antioch or on the other side to Alexandria. I don't mean to say that all persons or intellectual movements are wrongly associated with Antioch, but only that because Antioch has become such a catch-all, the category can become at times almost meaningless. The label Antiochian can refer, sometimes does refer, to an exceedingly broad range of literal historical exegesis and two natures or two persons Christologies, all the way from the 3rd to the 6th centuries even. Just as often, those scholars have applied the label Antiochian to various subsets of this massive group. For example, sometimes it refers to the Christology leading up to Theodore of Mopsuestia, sometimes to a doctrinal network beginning only after Theodore's generation with Theodoret of Cyrus, and sometimes only to the exegetical side of things. And even this is split up in different ways. So it's not only that the category Antiochian is altogether too extensive, but also that it can embrace a wide variety of more specific phenomena therein. Now, obviously, as I said, I'm not going to solve this whole problem today, as if anyone could, but I'll instead discuss 2 items. First, I'll explore how the rhetoric surrounding the 6th century condemnation of Theodore, along with select works of Theodoret of Cyrus and Ibis of Edessa, has shaped our picture of Diodore's earlier historical school. I hope to show how, when the ancient sources which speak of the historical school headed by Theodore are read together with these later polemical works of the so-called 3 chapters controversy, the historical monastery school of Diodore ends up being muddled or confused with much broader Christological, especially, but also exegetical trends. What results from reading these together in so much of the scholarship is that Diodore's monastery school becomes universalized or idealized such that the school of Antioch or Antiochian can refer to any exegesis or theology which vaguely resembles those of Diodore and Theodore. So after discussing this ancient literature, I'll conclude briefly by outlining an alternative way forward, suggesting that we replace largely the label Antiochian with Theodoran, in reference not to broad similarities in theology or exegesis, but to a network of readers, specifically readers of Theodore. So first on Diodore's school in the ecclesiastical historians. The passages from the early ecclesiastical historians most often cited with reference to a school of Antioch are those of Socrates and Solheid on the Asketerion, or the monastery led by Diodore of Tarsus, and an otherwise unknown Carterius. The passage in Socrates, which Solheid depends on, is not terribly concerned with the monastic school itself, but instead with John Chrysostom's role therein. The discussion of the school takes place within larger narratives of John Chrysostom's ministry in Antioch and then Constantinople. Despite Chrysostom's obvious preeminence, both historians impress upon the reader the impact of the school by noting that 4 of its members, 1 teacher and 3 students, go on to become prominent bishops, The first three are, of course, Diodor in Tarsus and Cilicia, Theodore in Mopsuestia, John Chrysostom, not in the Diocese of Antioch, but in Constantinople. And then the final is the otherwise little known Maximus, who becomes the Bishop of Seleucia Pieria. It's within this short passage that we learn a very little about the content of Diodor's teaching. Socrates, with Solheid following him, writes that Diodor, quote, wrote many books in which he attended only to the letter of Holy Scripture while avoiding its theoria. These statements, of course, bear out in what little remains of Diodor's works, and especially in the works of his student Theodore. Solheid and Socrates mention no further generations of the school, or even whether it existed beyond the election of Diodor to the See of Tarsus. Although it's not uncommon to hear in handbooks and introductions to exegesis and things of that sort, that Theodore of Mopsuestia takes over for Diodor as the school's teacher, there's no literary evidence for this until a statement, itself apologetically loaded, from a Syriac source in the late 6th or more likely early 7th century. And I'll mention this work momentarily. The silence on the continuation of Diodor's school means that there's no mention even of Nestorius in connection with the school, despite the fact that a century after Solheid and Socrates, the historian Evagrius and the Emperor Justinian both claim that Nestorius was a student of Theodore of Mopsuestia. Well, I'm not questioning the historicity of the claim that Nestorius was a hearer of Theodore. Neither Evagrius nor Justinian suggest Nestorius studied with Theodore at Diodor's former school. My point here is simply this, that there's no indication that Diodor's school in the mountains surrounding Antioch survived beyond his elevation to the bishopric in Tarsus. So where does the idea of a longer-lived school of Antioch come from, and why is it so frequently suggested that Nestorius and Theodoret, among others, both studied at Diodor's school under Theodore of Mopsuestia? Well, it appears that scholars have often read these ecclesiastical historians together with the polemical literature of the 6th century, leading up to the 3 chapters controversy in the Second Council of Constantinople. To a lesser extent, also, they rely on the apologetic literature from the so-called Nestorian Church. Both of these bodies of literature do something similar. They create fictive pedagogical lineages which link Theodore and Diodor with later ecclesiastics who, while they do broadly agree with these figures theologically, have no personal or pedagogical relationship with them, no historical relationship with Theodore or Diodor. Because of the rhetoric of this 6th and 7th century literature, which places Theodoret of Cyrus and Ibis of Edessa, among others, within a pedagogical lineage with Theodore and Diodor, scholars have naturally assumed that these later figures were educated at an enduring school of Antioch, which is traced back to Diodor. So first, on the polemical literature of the 6th century against the Nestorians and those associated with them. In his Deprehensio et Triumphus Super Nestorianos, probably written in the 530s, Leontius of Byzantium takes issue with those who continue to defend Theodore of Mopsuestia's works. In this treatise, Leontius, drawing from a deep well of Christian heresiological literature, creates a pedagogical chain of heretics, a lineage of students and teachers. What's so effective about Leontius's work is that part of this pedagogical genealogy is historical, while part of it is fabricated. Because part of it is historical, the fabricated, the fictive part takes on real life as well. In the opening of this treatise, Leontius claims that, quote, though they do not accept any of the holy God-given doctors of the church at all, except for Theodore and Diodor, they pretend in words not to accept the first springs of their impiety. Leontius thus lays out 2 competing series of fathers. The orthodox series of examples makes no claims to genealogy, but merely that they agree in the truth. Athanasius of Alexandria, the Cappadocians, and John Chrysostom, notably an Antiochian. In contrast, the impious are arranged into a pedagogical lineage which centers on the historical relationship between Diodor and Theodore. And although Leontius makes no claim that Nestorius is a student of Theodore, he makes it clear through extensive quotation of these writers that Diodor, who, quote, attacked the title Theotokos, shares the Christology of Theodore and of Nestorius after him. At the end of this treatise, we finally hear explicitly, in a striking, what I'm terming a cloacal metaphor, first, what is the source of these heretical waters? Quote, they began with Paul of Samosata, came down through the intervening generations to Diodor, who was your leader in these outrages, and were so cultivated by you and developed to such a size that your abundant river overshadows its godless spring. And Leontius continues to describe the body of fetid water into which this polluted river flows. Quote, then came your aqueduct, your narrow pipe, which couldn't receive the whole flow of your impiety, Nestorius. And even if he could receive it, still he didn't dare to pour forth the floods of your blasphemies for all, not through weakness of will, but because there were too many of them to flow freely. While we already knew of the historical relationship between Diodor and Theodore from the ecclesiastical historians, from Leontius we learn that Diodor shared in Theodore's and Nestorius's heresy, and thus that the whole lineage is corrupt. But we also learn that the pedagogical lineage, per Leontius, is much longer than one from Diodor to Theodore to Nestorius. It began with the hazy heresy of Antioch's arch-heretic Paul of Samosata. So while some of this lineage is historical, most of it is, some of it, the connection with Paul of Samosata, is entirely fabricated, and yet through natural and pedagogical metaphors is made an integral part of this whole lineage. Leontius appears to have been writing prior to the so-called 3 chapters controversy and the Second Council of Constantinople. He makes no mention of Theodoret and only alludes briefly to Ibis of Edessa. His focus is solely on Diodor, Theodore, and Nestorius, and finally he associates them with Paul of Samosata. In contrast, in the following decade leading up to the council in 553, the Emperor Justinian works hard to associate Theodore as the founder or fount of the Nestorian heresy with his fictive students, that is, his readers, especially Theodoret of Cyrus and Ibis of Edessa. Justinian himself alludes to the fact that there is disagreement during this time concerning whose writings, which of their writings should be condemned. Since they hadn't previously been anathematized, the works of Theodore, Theodoret, and Ibis were considered fair game by some. However, in Justinian's propagation of the 3 chapters and the anathemas contained in his edict on the true faith, these individuals came to be irrevocably, in the Greek and Latin worlds at least, connected to the heresy of Nestorius. As Justinian has it, though, the heresy doesn't really begin with or belong to Nestorius, but to Theodore of Mopsuestia, which leads then to the heresy of Nestorius and to so many others, including Theodoret. Theodoret's writings are condemned in the 3 chapters, not because he's Nestorian, but because he's attempting to defend the orthodoxy of Theodore. Indeed, as Justinian writes, through the tutelage of Theodore, both Nestorius and Theodoret are turned aside to heresy. Quote, it is true the Church of God anathematizes the leaders of heresies by name, but Theodore was not only the teacher of Nestorius's godless impiety, but he also deceived many others through his wicked writings. Now, since Theodore has become a heresiarch and disgorged his countless blasphemies in his books, you have no just cause for seeking to remove the anathema against him, end quote. Theodoret at no point is claimed to have been a pupil of Theodore, as Nestorius was. Yet anyone, Justinian claims, through reading Theodore's books becomes his pupil and can thereby be turned aside to his heresy. Note that there is a claim of pedagogical lineage, not through presence at Theodore's church or school, but through reading. There's no claim to a historical relationship between Theodoret and Theodore, and yet, through Theodoret's reading of Theodore, Theodoret becomes Theodoran, or as the scholarly literature more often holds, Antiochene. Justinian's genealogical pedagogical logic is admittedly not quite as clear as that of Leontius. Nevertheless, in his condemnation of the 3 chapters, he outlines a lineage that begins with Theodore and for which there's no end in sight, because any reader can become a part of this lineage. Nestorius was really Theodore's student. However, anyone who reads Theodore, whether Theodoret, Ibis, you or I, likewise become his student and thus a part of a larger corrupt lineage. So when scholars read the rhetoric of Leontius and Justinian together with the ecclesiastical historians, it's easy to see how they perceive a concrete school, which includes Diodor, Theodore, Theodoret, Nestorius, Ibis of Edessa, as well as some who come before and some who come after, as belonging to this school. There's no natural connection, however, between Diodor's school and Theodoret or Ibis. The connection is instead polemically fabricated. Okay, there's a little bit more to it than this, and we'll get to it momentarily, but the genealogies are fabricated, right? And are spoken of rhetorically. There is one other place where the idea of a larger school of Antioch comes from, and I'll mention this only briefly, and this is in the apologetic literature of the so-called Nestorian Syriac Church. There's a treatise entitled The Cause of the Schools, written by Barchad Bashaba in the late 6th or early 7th century, and it narrates the origin of the later Syriac schools in Edessa and Nisibis. Much of this work is devoted to crafting a pedagogical genealogy, and as for Leontius, some of this is historical and some of it is fictive. All of it, though, is not polemical, but is apologetic. As it relates to Diodor's school, Barchad Bashaba claims that the earlier Antiochian school is a literal precursor to the schools which flourished in late antique Syriac-speaking cities. The school, as he relates, is founded by Eustathius and the bishop of Antioch after the Council of Nicaea, and is eventually down the line entrusted to Diodor. Quote, "When this Saint Diodor was consecrated Bishop of Tarsus, his disciples were dispersed, but no one but the blessed Theodore remained in the monastery, where he taught for a long time." End quote. So this is the first mention that I can find of Theodore taking over for Diodor's exegetical school in Antioch. Now, eventually, and I'm going to abbreviate here, eventually, it's narrated that Theodore's works are translated into Syriac so that Theodore can be the sort of teacher or the interpreter of the Syrian church. Now, I'll readily admit that this Syriac literature has influenced Western ideas of Christianity much less than those of the Chalcedonian Greek sources of the Three Chapters controversy. However, in those who do turn to this Syriac literature, Barchad Bashaba's apologetic lineage ends up reinforcing the polemical lineages of Leontius and Justinian. These works, which otherwise are so at odds with one another, nevertheless both point to a definitive lineage of students of Theodore in particular, whether they're defending or attacking his theology. Despite this agreement, and however much these conceptions of Antiochian Christianity have been accepted in the scholarship, neither the apologetics nor the polemics speak entirely to a historical phenomenon of a school which passes beyond the bounds of Diodor and Theodore. All the other pedagogical relationships which these texts establish are fabricated. Okay, now it's not a mere fabrication, and I'll get to what I want to say sort of constructively about Antiochian figures and how their theology and exegesis are related to one another. So drawing from both the polemical and the apologetic works discussed, I want to suggest two related points. First, that we speak not of Antiochenes in this case, but of Theodorans. And second, that the Theodorans not be considered a school with historical pedagogical lineages, but instead as a network of readers, of Theodore's works. In other words, the group of individuals whom we normally refer to as Antiochenes, or sometimes the School of Antioch, can largely, but not entirely, be maintained so long as it's redefined in reference to Theodore and his readers. Briefly, why not Antiochene? Well, Antioch is simply too diverse from the 4th to the 6th centuries. In the late 4th century, Antioch is a bastion of Eunomianism. There are different Nicene sects. In the 5th and 6th centuries, we have prominent Antiochenes who are variously one natures and two natures and two persons Christologies. Many of these, furthermore, are simply not Antiochene taken in any of the usual Christological or exegetical senses. More significant in my mind is the fact that even among the historical school, that is Diodor's school, there's significant theological and exegetical diversity. John Chrysostom is decidedly not Theodoran in his exegesis or Christology, nor does he, as far as I can tell, read Theodore. There are, and this is a sort of supposition, there are hints in the other direction that Theodore read John Chrysostom's sermons and found them wanting exegetically. I'll also say very briefly that John Chrysostom probably belongs, if we're thinking in terms of networks of readers, that he probably belongs to a different network that is reading the Cappadocians, but that's an argument for a different day. Why then use the term Theodoran, defined as a network of readers? First, we have plenty of evidence, even in Leontius and Justinian, that many in late antiquity who had no personal connection to Theodore, including Theodoret and Ibis, nevertheless read Theodore, whether his Christological or exegetical works, and sometimes even venerated him as the interpreter. Furthermore, Peter Martins and others have identified concrete exegetical traditions that suggest networks of readers. Whether these are of Theodore's works or they're reading each other is a sort of a different question. Although Martins and others continue to employ Antiochene heuristically, it's usually held loosely and has to be carefully defined. Second and finally, the label Theodoran also functions as, I hope, a more sensitive heuristic than Antiochene, because we're able to identify how and to what extent individuals received Theodore's work, and what they draw from him exegetically or Christologically. It's no longer necessary, being influenced by Leontius and Justinian, to gesture wildly to any variety of exegesis which happens to be historical or literal, or any Christology which happens to be two natures or two persons. Instead, only those which witness to some real influence of Theodore can be identified as belonging to this network. And the final sentence, Paul, this network of readers of Theodore thus provides us with a heuristic category which casts a wide net. This is important for categories, but is nevertheless rooted more securely in the textual record that comes down to us. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your paper there. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them after, or write them down if you're like me and you'll forget otherwise. All right. Next, we have John Solheid at the University of Toronto and the University of St. Michael's College. And his paper is Church as Institution from Aggiornamento to Ressourcement.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert, for your paper. I want to start by saying that had this conference happened in the fall, I would have written a completely different paper. But over the last several months, I've been thinking about other ideas in light of current events. And this paper is a part of that thinking. And as it will become abundantly clear, my thoughts on it are still pretty incoherent and in their germ form. So please bear with me. I beg your patience. The field of patristics has experienced a significant evolution over the last several decades. Now, some of this evolution has resulted from discoveries of new texts or texts long lost to history, such as Nag Hammadi, Tura Papyri, or in my own case, Origen's homilies on the Psalms. Many of these changes, however, have been methodological or perhaps epistemological, hermeneutical, whatever you want to call it. Particularly impactful has been the rise of interdisciplinarity, which has to some extent become the rule rather than the exception in patristic studies. Now, to be clear, interdisciplinarity has indeed made some valuable contributions, insights from social historians, sociologists, literary theorists, and so on. But the introduction of various postmodern and critical theories has certainly had, like I said, a positive impact, but it has also come with some consequences. Now, one only needs a cursory exploration of introductions to monographs over the last 3 or 4 decades to notice how much of an impact postmodernism has shaped current scholarly discourse. Certain key terms like interrupt, disrupt, subvert, and their cognates, along with power and social constructs, pervade much of our methodological discussions. And while postmodernism has made some insightful contributions, namely, for example, Elizabeth Clark's application of network theory to the Origenist controversy was incredibly insightful, and William Johnson's sociology of reading communities greatly shaped my own dissertation, they have brought with them assumptions about our sources about the nature of knowledge, and even about the reason why we study early Christian theology and history to begin with, that I regard to some extent as having some problematic consequences. One important weakness that I would like to address in what follows is that postmodern scholarship has tended to neglect or obfuscate the specific theological questions with which our authors were engaged. Another way of putting it is that postmodern scholarship has often paid not sufficient attention to the institutional context in which early Christians conducted their theological discourse. Now, even within the Roman Catholic ecclesiological context, the same neglect of institution as a concept has taken shape, especially since the Second Vatican Council, when even the term institution in reference to the church has become somewhat pejorative. This is notable at the very beginning, for example, of Vatican II's dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium. That document originally had begun with the discussion of the church as hierarchical, in other words, the church as an institution. But in the final draft, that motto was placed last behind two other mottos. First, the church as mystery, and the church as people of God. Now, such a shift was, to be clear, a response against the ecclesiology stemming from the Council of Trent, and later the Ultramontane Church of Vatican I, plagued by a juridicism that positioned the clergy on a higher plane than the laity, and oftentimes a very stagnant spirituality. One of the trade-offs of this move, however, has been to put the institutional model of the church on the back shelf. I would like to take a moment to reflect on how we can renew our understanding of the church as an institution, as an aid both for patristic scholarship and to reflect on the value of institutions, especially the church, in our contemporary society. Now, due to the time constraints of this paper, my discussion will be only very brief, and it's really more of an intellectual exercise than anything. But before we begin, I want to say a word about definitions. I'm not going to compare several different definitions of institutions that certainly exist, but will simply start with the definition that I will follow throughout this paper, a definition I take from two different authors who are quite complementary in certain respects. Christoph Marxies, for example, provides a very helpful starting point. He defined institutions as, quote, social arrangements that outwardly and inwardly effectively suggest and bring into force stability and duration, and in which especially the conduct guiding and communication directing foundations of an order are also always symbolically brought to expression. Now, to retranslate that English translation of very complicated German into more readable English, I will state the matter more succinctly. An institution is a social organization that is both stable over time and functions to guide and form our thought, our speech, and our conduct. Similarly, and perhaps in a less complicated way, modern American public intellectual Yuval Levin describes the matter this way when he says that institutions structure our perceptions and our interactions, and as a result, they structure us. They form our habits, our expectations, and ultimately our character. One example he uses is the nuclear family, in which such an institution, parents, for example, will ask themselves, what is my particular responsibility towards my children in light of my role as a parent in given situation X? So the institution of the family guides and forms the behavior and the thoughts of the parents and how they raise their children. Now, to return to my grievance with postmodernism, I'll use but a few examples to flesh out what I'm trying to get at here in my paper. I'll use 3 examples that I suggest are indicative, and perhaps I might be a little too harsh on these authors, but I'll take criticisms at the end. The first, in his study of allegorical exegesis in the Alexandrian tradition, David Dawson suggested that allegorical interpreters used allegory, quote, to subvert competing worldviews and forms of life. These ancient interpreters applied allegorical reading in order to, quote, secure for themselves and their community's social and cultural identity, authority, and power, end quote. Power, he said, was being exercised via one text over other worldviews and other texts. Dawson, you see, puts the emphasis on power, suggesting somewhat that early allegorical exegetes somehow manipulated a text to meet their own needs and to establish themselves as authoritative interpreters. Elizabeth Clark, in her reading Renunciation, responds against the stranglehold that historical criticism has on modern biblical studies and modern historical scholarship in general, and contends that early Christian exegetes approached the biblical text in light of their own theological commitments, particularly asceticism. And in this respect, I think her book does pay needed attention to the institutional frameworks in which early Christian writers interpreted the Bible. These fathers, she maintains, read the Bible within their particular religious worldview and their social values. At the same time, she says that these early Christian writers ascribed, quote, a new meaning, an ascetic meaning to the Bible by, quote, a literal erasure or replacement of the biblical words. So in other words, they turned the Bible into something other than what it was meant to be. There's an element of arbitrariness in early Christian exegetes in Clark's reading, in which the fathers impose their own values on the letter of the text. Thus, while responding against the dominance of historical criticism in her own day, Clark seems to place the fathers within postmodern literary strategies, rather than within their own ecclesiastical context. Now, more recently, Blossom Stefaniou, in an otherwise very intriguing discussion of Didymus the Blind's lectures on the Psalms, rejects the traditional interpretation of these lectures from Didymus's school of Christian instruction in Alexandria and separates them from any, quote, confessional preoccupations. Stefaniou criticized the traditional scholarship on the grounds that it assumed, on the one hand, that religion was something monolithic and rigid, and on the other hand, she criticized it based on problems that historians have had grappling with the nature of the Alexandrian catechetical school, which Didymus was supposed to have run. Now, the Alexandrian catechetical school has provided so many problems for scholars over the last several decades. I'm not entirely sure anybody has adequately grasped that institution. I don't want to get into that problem here because it's a rabbit hole I just don't want to dig right now. But in her book, she neglected very explicit theological or confessional discussions in these lectures. For example, we find Didymus identifying the prosopon, speaking in Psalm 40 as the Savior, ek tu prosopou to sotiros. Now, this prosopological reading in Didymus's lecture led a very astute student to ask a question when the course came to the verse 5, which reads, as for me, I said, O Lord, have mercy on me, heal my soul because I sinned against you. One student said, well, wait a minute here. If this is spoken from the person of the Savior, did the Savior sin? In other words, the discussion that unfolds in this lecture is a discussion rooted in the Apollinarian controversy over the nature of Christ in the 4th century, a very confessional debate that unfolded in this discussion in which Didymus applies the term propadia to try to explain how Jesus here says that he could have sinned. Didymus's explanation is not very compelling. Now, regarding Origen himself, the nature of the institution and the formative nature of the institution on his exegesis and preaching is found prominently in his homilies on the Psalms, a text with which I have dedicated the better part of the last 4 years. I'll make a few remarks on his homilies on Psalm 77 that can illustrate my point. Now, anybody familiar with the Septuagint Psalm 77 will know that it's laden with Lenten symbolism as it narrates the Israelite exodus from Egypt, God parting the waters, leading the Israelites to the Holy Land, feeding them manna on their way. Now, Origen's homilies fit a very liturgical framework, as I will try to demonstrate here, and that liturgical framework indeed guides his exegesis of the psalm. Harold Buchinger and Maren Niehoff have made arguments, in fact, that these 9 homilies on Psalm 77 give us substantial insight into the Easter practices of 3rd century Caesarean Christian church. In homily 4, for example, Origen preached on the manna from heaven, which God rained down on the people to eat during their exodus. Of course, he gives this text an allegorical reading with a lengthy exposition on the soul's need for spiritual nourishment. Juxtaposing spiritual combat imagery from Ephesians 6:12 with the training of athletes in preparation for the Olympic Games, Origen chastised his audience for their lax liturgical participation. After some great rhetorical flourish in which he really lambasts his listeners for never attending, he says, after all, if you could, you would come on the Lord's Day, Eis Kyriakon, to take your spiritual nourishment and thus be nourished for salvation in a way that would last not just 6 or 7 days, but many of the Lord's days. And yet some of you are disdainful and stay without nourishment for a whole year, but they come on the few days of the so-called Pascha, so that they can be nourished on those days. Buchinger and Niehoff have identified the allusion here to Easter practices in this intriguing expression, the few days of the so-called Pascha, ep oligas tas tu Pascha. Buchinger, who's already done substantial scholarship on Origen and the sacraments, or Origen and the Eucharist, I should say, notes the scant historical evidence related to the Easter liturgical celebrations in Caesarea at this time. He suggests that ep oligas tas tu Pascha could refer to two different things. On the one hand, it could refer to a certain number of days prior to the Easter celebration, something like a Holy Week, or a number of days following Easter, something analogous to the Easter octave. He doesn't resolve that problem. He says there's just not enough evidence to determine either way. Niehoff, on the other hand, makes a rather compelling case for the former interpretation, reading this as a few days prior to the Easter celebration. Now, she arrives at this conclusion by reading the passage from the homily against a preceding discussion in the same homily, in which Origen describes the great games. After his allusion to Ephesians 6:12 to illustrate the spiritual nature of the soul's combat, he applies an analogy of the great games. He says, or don't you know what is recorded about those contests called the great games? In them are present, sent by the judges of the Pan-Hellenic games, those who keep watch over the athlete. They watch how he eats, etc., etc. And he continues next, so that they may receive a perishable crown. Notice 1 Corinthians 9:25. They take upon themselves hard work, namely the work involved in a strict diet, the work of training and of manifold travels and of marchings on the road. And among them are often men who have grown a beard and are beaten and accept to be hit by the supervisors, receiving blows on their back and stomach, end quote. Niehoff highlights here the training period that athletes had to endure before their competitions, and connects this with Origen's discourse about the Christians neglecting their own Christian liturgical obligations in the days preceding Easter. Read in light of this rhetorical usage of the training of athletes, ep oligas tas tu Pascha is a reference to a period of preparation for the Easter celebration, a period of fasting and attendance at the liturgy of the word. While too little attention has been paid to the liturgical background of Origen's biblical interpretation, in light of these observations, his fourth discourse on Psalm 77 is remarkable for the liturgical imagery, feeding on the heavenly manna with references to John 6:51 as the manna that rained down from heaven during the soul's journeying through the spiritual desert in preparation for the great feast of Pascha. While in his fourth homily in Psalm 77, Origen's pastoral concern was with the liturgical participation of his audience, particularly their need to attend the liturgy for the soul's nourishment, his first homily in Psalm 77 addresses the dilemma his Christian audience faced vis-a-vis their Jewish neighbors in Caesarea, giving us another window into how the institution informed Origen's interpretation of the text and the message he wanted to portray to his audience. He began this homily with a lengthy and fascinating discussion of a scribal error in which a copyist of Matthew's gospel inserted the name Isaiah into Matthew 13:35, in which Jesus says, in order that what the prophet Isaiah said may be fulfilled, I have opened my mouth in parables and uttered problems from the beginning. He says, he corrects the scribe by saying it should read Asaph instead of Isaiah, since Jesus was quoting Psalm 77 verse 2, a psalm of the prophet Asaph, not Isaiah. Apparently the scribe was ignorant that the prophet Asaph was indeed a prophet. Of course, as will become clear, this seeming excursus on a textual problem was of central exegetical purpose because it permitted Origen to place the first two verses of Psalm 77 into the person, the prosopon of Jesus. Now, the first words are, "Pay heed, my people, to my law." And from this, Origen tells his audience that indeed the law that this psalm was speaking of was the gospel, since this is Jesus uttering these words, not the Jewish ritual laws. Keep in mind that simultaneous, if these were indeed preached during a season in preparation for Easter, something like a contemporary Lent, these would have been delivered simultaneously as their Jewish neighbors were preparing for the feast of Passover. Origen here is addressing the particular problem of Christians participating in Jewish ritual practices, a problem that Paul Blauer says went both ways. It wasn't just Christians that were upset with other Christians participating in Jewish practices. There's rabbinical sources that indicate that the Jews themselves were upset with some of their followers for engaging in Christian practices. So there's a bit of a missionary struggle here. To conclude, rather abruptly, when Rousseau opens his social contract with the words, "Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains," he uttered a sentiment about a mistrust in our institutions that would find a very suitable home today. His point, of course, is that while human beings possess free will, it's social institutions that keep them bound in chains. The first institution, he notes, is the family, in which parents and siblings are bound to obligations with each other until the children become adults, and then they're freed. Now, while there have been some insightful contributions from scholars of postmodernism who often share some mistrust of institutions and power that Rousseau reflects in the social contract, the student of patristics, by paying close attention to both the institutional commitments of our authors and our own institutional and theological commitments, have much to contribute to ongoing scholarship in the field. On the one hand, reading our authors in their institutional context grounds our own historical and theological scholarship by reading our sources in light of the questions they were asking. It gives us the methodological discipline. On the other hand, it also allows us to read them in such a way that their voices continue to create constructive avenues of engaging with contemporary theological and social discussions. It also reminds us of the importance and necessity of institutions in our own intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation. In light of current cultural trends, I suggest that can only be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And for our last paper of this session, we will have Andrew Summerson at Lumen Christi Institute and St. Mary Byzantine Catholic Church. And their paper is Maximus the Confessor as Interpreter of Gregory the Theologian, How to Do Patristic Theology.
Thanks so much. It's good to be with you all. It's the end of a pretty long day. Couple things. This is, I'm double header today. Today I had an earlier presentation on Maximus, entirely different topics. So this is also kind of a foray into new terrain for me. I just published a book on Maximus's exegesis in relationship to his ascetical thought, sort of as an interpreter of the scripture and of the human heart. And so this next step that I'm trying to take is trying to understand how Maximus reads Gregory the Theologian in his Ambigua, and sort of not just sort of uses him to say what he wants to say, but rather incorporates his theological reflection into his own vision. So this is for the fact that it's new, the fact that I had a double header, it's a little bit more of a workshop paper. So I appreciate your patience and would welcome any comments that you could do and offer to, kind of move some of this work along. So allow me to begin. Former US Poet Laureate Billy Collins writes the following poem, Introduction to Poetry, that I think is very useful in setting up our present task to discuss Maximus the Confessor's reading of Gregory the Theologian and to figure out what we might derive from the Confessor's engagement of Nazianzen about how to receive early Christian texts. I'll read to you Billy Collins's poem. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Recovery of patristic theology today lies mainly in the task of reading. Consider here the activities that Collins proposes to describe the ideal procedure. Holding a slide up to the light is both extraordinary and a delicate process, as we see once an obscure tile of microfilm become intelligible to us, holding it ever so carefully to the light. How much more is the work of carefully evaluating patristic texts, bringing them to the light, all the more difficult? Like Collins's poems, early Christian texts are a maze that we drop ourselves into. We are to dwell into them and to scurry around in unfamiliar terrain, feeling around with the blunt instrument of our snouts, sometimes more than gut intuition, little more than gut intuition, to map out their thought patterns, that of the fathers. Pressing our ear to these texts carries an implicit danger, as they are alive with the hum of ideas about God that are not our own, and may very well challenge our conventions and prick our consciences. Finally, these are texts which can inspire delight, gliding upon the fresh water of this wellspring. The evocative images that Collins desires for his students fall before a seeming defeat. Before impatient, fearful, unmotivated readers, one is left with brutalized and tortured readings of texts, the meanings of which are left misunderstood by scholars and students alike. How does this come to bear today on Maximus's reading of Gregory for our own devices? I would say there's a temptation today to read Maximus the Confessor's largest work known to us, the Ambigua, a study of difficult passages in Gregory the Theologian's orations, as if it is an exercise in the tortured reading of a text described by Collins above. One of the more influential studies of Maximus, Hans Urs von Balthasar's Cosmic Liturgy, says as much. For von Balthasar, Gregory was simply the ecclesial vehicle for Maximus's more sophisticated theology. On this view, Maximus's fanciful readings are something of a forced confession, contorting Gregory's text to get them to say what he wants them to say, or simply as a pretext for his own creative theology. It can be argued that von Balthasar's view of the relationship between Maximus and Gregory is a parallel of how von Balthasar himself uses the figures of Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and Maximus in his trilogy of monographs. I've somewhat diminished sympathy for him here. Von Balthasar's view is also emblematic of the 19th and 20th century predominant representation of the Cappadocian Fathers, a modern convention if we ever heard one, and still more of the underappreciation that's due to Gregory in that same period. On this view, Basil is active, Gregory of Nyssa the contemplative, and Gregory Nazianzus is the complaining orator. This fails to take into account the sheer preponderance of evidence that demonstrates the wide influence of Gregory Nazianzus in subsequent centuries. Already in the 400s, he was translated into Latin. Medieval copies exist in a variety of languages. After the scriptures, he is the most prolific manuscript tradition within the Byzantine manuscript tradition. It's the Byzantine tradition himself that calls him the Theologian, a title only given to John the Evangelist and Simeon the New Theologian. And the second was likely a joke, taking a jab at his newfangled theology. He is celebrated together with the three holy hierarchs, Basil the Great and John Chrysostom included, precisely for his theological significance. Gregory also had a wide influence on high and low culture, monasticism, and lay. His orations and poetry were used in medieval rhetoric, handbooks at school. His prose largely developed the Byzantine hymnography as we know it, as many of his orations figure prominently into the liturgical cycle of the Byzantine Rite. We just celebrated the Feast of the Annunciation today, and at the Theotokion of the Praises, we have a quote in the hymn there that is precisely from Gregory's first Paschal oration. Christ took upon the former so that he might give us the better, right? And this hymnographic tradition that I just referred to is likely due to the commentary generated by Gregory's orations. We have 20 of them recorded in the Clavis yet Maximus's Ambigua is the largest sustained work to survive of a much longer tradition of interpretation. Obviously, there's been quite a renewal of interest in Gregory's thought, so I'm rehearsing a little bit of what some of you might know already. Nevertheless, hence to think of Maximus's Ambigua as an attempt to eschew such a pivotal player of Gregory, as Gregory in favor of his own fanciful ideas, is just highly unlikely. Maximus's own recorded reverence for the theologian suggests the contrary. For Maximus, Gregory is the great and wonderful teacher. He is willing to give Gregory the benefit of the doubt, even defending his mistaking John the Evangelist as John the Forerunner in the 22nd Ambiguum. And even if you look at Maximus's mystagogy, while Maximus overtly admits his indebtedness to Dionysius the Areopagite in his interpretation of the divine liturgy, what you find throughout is just sort of offhanded comments that are really citations of Gregory the theologian that just sort of let you know that he just really digested his grammar and his vernacular and just sort of and allows Gregory's language to become his own casual way of speaking theologically. So the question I want to address today is, how then does Maximus read Gregory the theologian? And how might this come to bear on our reading of the patristic tradition and our reception of it today? What we see in Maximus's read of Gregory is, I would argue, a creative appropriation of the tradition. Maximus approaches Gregory's words with veneration. In the words of Billy Collins, I think he tries to hold his words up to the light to see it from all sides. He presses it to his ear to hear it hum about the words of God and glides over his use of language. As a sort of a working concept for you, is what I think we see in the Ambigua is that Gregory is for Maximus what Homer is for the Neoplatonic commentators. As has been widely noted and alluded to in John's paper, allegorical readings of Homer profoundly influenced Christian scriptural interpretation. And this process of appropriating these rhetorical tools profoundly shaped the formation of Christian culture. Educated figures like the father-son team of Apollinarius and Gregory Nazianzen himself brought their deep learning, and as such, their works proved durable in the face of, for example, Julian the Apostate's campaign to deprive Christians of their access to culture by refusing their access to the different schools. One of the reasons Julian's program failed is that by this time, Christianity had a robust culture of its own. And here I quote Cardinal Newman: Christianity has long passed beyond the letter of documents and the reasoning of individual minds and has become public property. Gregory's theological output and legacy is evidence of this shift and the public property and culture that is generated. So Maximus thus sees in the person and writing of Gregory as a father that he needs to affiliate himself with, right? And further, he needs to integrate this father's culture into his own theology, right? So really just have kind of two more specific comments that I think I want to continue with my conversation today. And it's going to be a little bit more general, talking a little bit about allegory as it's used in Maximus with respect to Gregory, and then focusing in on his interpretation of the second Paschal oration 45, in a series of Ambiguum. Now, one of the more obvious traits that Maximus's interpretation of Gregory throughout the Ambiguum is his use of allegory. In particular, the longest set of one sustained interpretation of one oration, that is the second Paschal oration, we see plenty of uses of allegory there. And Maximus is responding to Gregory's exhortations in the original delivery of the homily to compare, exhort, and the crowd, the faithful there gathered, to imitate certain biblical characters, such as Rachel and Leah, or Simon of Cyrene, the wise thief, the not so wise thief. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, Mary of Salome, Peter, John, or Thomas. And Maximus gives his own response to Gregory's exhortations by allegorizing these figures, and his subsequent teaching is then built upon these initial allegorical presuppositions that Maximus lays forth, right? Now, our modern sensibilities are quite suspicious of allegory, and such readings may be considered a non-starter. I think your point, John, about Dawson is really well taken here. We might think that this is a power grab on the part of Maximus. Okay, let's get on with the real theology, Gregory. I'm going to do it for you, but I'm going to use your text as my starting point, right? However, I would argue that allegory is in many ways the sincerest form of flattery in the early and late antique Christian world. This means that a text was considered to be fertile and pregnant with meaning and waiting for interpretation. Maximus alludes to this in his characterization of Gregory in the Ambigua. He writes in the prologue to the addressee, Thomas, for you are well aware that St. Gregory the Theologian was a man of profound thoughts, but of comparatively few words, and so he compels his interpreters, even those who command extraordinary powers of speech and philosophical brilliance, to go on at great length and touch on a wide range of interests. Now, I don't want to pass by the irony of Maximus's words here. Gregory is one of the most prolific writers in the late antique Christian world, right? We got 45 orations, 250 letters, 17,000 lines of poetry. Nevertheless, what Maximus is saying here is his literary output is overshadowed by his depth of thought, right? To engage in allegory then for Maximus is a serious attempt to plumb these depths, right? Consider that such interpretive practices of allegory were reserved primarily for scripture in the Christian realm of things, suggests that utilizing these tools reserved for scripture on Gregory's work was not a debasement of his work, but the highest form of praise, right? Further, Maximus's use of allegory here underscores the aims of Gregory's oratory. Gregory's homilies invite the hearers to, in their original delivery, invite the hearers to a certain sacramental participation of the feast itself, right? Even the way the liturgy and the hymnographic tradition that is indebted to the orational tradition of Gregory the Theologian will use this refrain today, right? Let's represent the feast today so that we can enter into. The liturgy is a work of anamnesis, a calling to mind, a calling up to the saving events of Christ in the past, for the present, but also the future. And it prompts its hearers to engage and to unite themselves to that reality made present in the liturgical celebration. In one of his more famous orations on the Nativity, which is rehearsed again in the hymnographic tradition of the Byzantine Church, also is a common refrain in Ukraine. That's how you say hello during the Christmas season. You say, Christ is born, glorify him. This is emphatically present tense here. Such rhetoric is no mere embellishment. Later Byzantine commentators will go on to call the work of rhetoric itself is used by Gregory as a sacrament, mysterion. Maximus's continued allegory of biblical figures found in Gregory's Oration 45 gives, I would say, Gregory a new audience to invite into this sacramental activity, right? Giving Gregory a new audience to indulge them in this sacramental participation. But what it also does is it suggests a change in space, right? We're no longer in the congregated ecclesia of the church, but the sacramental anamnesis that Maximus wants to continue in his Ambiguum takes place on the internalized level in the space of the heart, right? Okay. I'll leave off the kind of an example of allegory here, but we can come back to it if there's a little bit of time. Now, I want to finish today on one ambiguum in particular that deals with Gregory's second Paschal oration, right? That gets to the heart of this internalization of the sacramental anamnesis. That's ambiguum 47. What Maximus is responding to in this ambiguum is Gregory's description of a particular detail of the Jewish Passover. He writes, quote, "Thank you. There is no surprise if at all a lamb must be sought." So this is part of Gregory's extended examination of the practices of Passover set forth by Moses in the Torah, right? Gregory tells us not to be surprised that everybody gets their own lamb in their house, but Maximus, he wants to examine this Jewish practice in particular. Why? How does he, I'm going to jump here since I have 3 minutes. This would seem to strike against the oneness of God that's proclaimed in creation, according to Maximus, and the law and the prophets. It seemed to individualize it too much. One conjecture might be that this individualized ritualistic practice of the Passover that Gregory brings up has now passed over to obviously a more communal practice in the celebration of the Eucharistic liturgy. Hence, this custom is foreign to Christians who have come to celebrate a more communal Pascha, right? Well, how does he end up interpreting this difficulty? He uses Paul, right? He recognized that Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, tells us, "I decided to know nothing in you except Jesus Christ and him crucified," right? So for Maximus, he's going to go on to say that the crucifixion with Christ is the mark of every believer. Quote, "For each of those who has believed in Christ according to his own power is crucified and has crucified Christ together with himself." That is, he is spiritually crucified together with Christ, right? So he's emphasizing this crucifixion that is required of every Christian here and now personally, emphasizing this point with the verb in its passive and active forms. Very good. So what he ends up saying is, interpreting it in this way, the individual Passover needs to be present in every soul. Each person has Christ present in him as an if kind of house. And so everybody needs his own divine lamb within him. That is some sort of internal crucifixion, right? I'll just finish by saying this. Maximus is considered, like, if he's going to be like a doctor of the church, which, you know, a couple Dominicans in France tried to get that across the finish line earlier in the 20th century, he would probably be the doctor of the cosmic incarnation, right? This idea that, as he says programmatically in Ambiguum 7, that the Word of God, who is God, wills always and in all things to effect the mystery of his embodiment. But in sort of, since I'm running out of time, I'll just cut to the chase. This heavy emphasis that ends up becoming another leitmotif throughout Maximus's work, this incarnation in the soul of every believer has a particularly paschal key, right? And he gets that from Gregory's Paschal oration. All visible realities, he'll say in the collected works in the Philokalia, need the cross, right? And so we appropriate and instantiate this continued work of Christ's incarnation in this Paschal way, which also underscores the ascetic element that Maximus brings into this cosmic vision of the incarnation. That's what I have since we're out of time. Very good.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that presentation. All right, we have roughly 10 minutes for questions. We'll try to get as ordered as possible. So either ask the question in the chat and we'll relay it, or do the little hand raise thing and we'll call. And I apologize for a little bit of the awkwardness of that, but you know, Zooms are always awkward. So Peter, if we can start with you, that'd be great.
Thank you. I'm unmuted. My comments are for the first presenter, Robert. the issue of the school of Alexandria and Antioch, this construct, has occupied a lot of my attention for the last 10 years. I think just by default, I found myself there, having written first on Origen and then on Theodore's close reader, Adrian. I enjoyed your talk, and I think you're moving in the right direction. Right then. I think I could talk with you for several hours about this topic, so I'm going to restrict myself to 2 comments, see how clear they are. 1, I think part of the problem here is the ambiguity of the word school, especially in English. It's in many European languages. School can mean an institution, bricks and mortar, St. Mike's in Toronto. But it can also be a style of expression that is shared. Well, Canadian illusion, group of 7 artists, right? Where proponents share similar views, similar techniques, and so on. I'm not convinced that when scholars speak about the school of Antioch, or for that matter, Alexandria, they are always distinguishing these 2 senses of the word school. And I would also say, I don't quite buy what I think you were selling, that scholars have fallen into the trap that Justinian or Leontius or the cause have set. I think what scholars have done is they've inclined towards seeing this as a shared school of thought, and that's where the problems have emerged. Because they go, oh, these are all literal readers, and then you say, okay, well, what, dear scholar, do you mean by literal exegesis? And there's a lot of hemming and hawing. And then you say, and oh, by the way, have you looked at Origen's commentary on Romans? That's all literal exegesis. So how in the world can you distinguish 2 schools based on literal exegesis? Anyways, that's sort of my first observation. Not to deny that Justinian is setting a trap, but I'm not sure how many contemporary scholars have fallen into it. Second, this network of readers idea, I mean, it's right on. I support this view. I think this is right. The rock solid proof came out of the Catena when they were edited. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Catena, like on Genesis or even Job. This is where so many Antiochian authors survive, and you can see, okay, how do they gloss Genesis 11? You see 5 authors lined up from the Antiochian tradition, and they're using almost the exact same Greek words, to the point where you have to almost say, I think that they're producing like 2nd and 3rd editions of what the first person said. These aren't even independent works. They're updating the textbook. It's that close a relationship. But your proposal that we see it as a Theodoran readership, might a polygenesis theory be a little bit better? Because they're not just reading Theodore, they're reading Diodor, but they're also reading Eusebius of Amasa. Like, this guy is all over the place. And part of the problem, of course, is he survives badly. But where he survives, oh my goodness, there are some really fascinating links to authors post-Theodore. So I'm wondering if there's nothing catchy here with a title. Theodoran readership sounds nice, but I'm not sure it quite captures the complexity of what we see.
Yeah.
Those are 2 big and rather meandering points, so I will shut up.
Well, let me just respond to the second one. I think you're right with the first, that that these later 6th century documents, 7th century documents might not be where scholars are sort of confusing the idea of what a school is. So I'll grant that. The second point, I mean, it's definitely the case that Eustathius, definitely Eusebius of Messa, and Diodor are being read. I think, and I have to, like I said, I'm at the beginning of this project. The way that I'm currently thinking about this, and I'm open to exploring this sort of other option, but the way I'm currently thinking about it is that there's a sort of well, it's almost like many things sort of work their way through Theodore. So Theodore's receiving this sort of earlier 4th century tradition, and then there's so much reception of Theodore afterwards. I think part of the problem too is that there is confusion. I'm confused, but there's general confusion about what to do with Christology and exegesis, or Christology versus exegesis. So whereas as far as I know, Eustathius, Eusebius don't have the same sort of anti-Apollinarian Christology that Diodor and Theodore have. You know, when we're referring to sort of Antiochian Christology, it refers to Theodore. I'm trying to think of a neat way to do this, and it's sort of it's really difficult at this point. But I'm trying to manage both the Christological and the exegetical. Yeah.
It's
Just
a
some
mess.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. Full sympathy. And you know, I want to create space for other people, but maybe we should find a time to chat afterward. I've mapped out all kinds of things about this stuff, and maybe there's a way to move your project forward.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hannah, you've been waiting patiently for a while.
Thanks. Okay, I'll try to be quick. I want to reflect on both John and Andrew's papers because they both kind of made me think the same thing. And to say it very briefly, they both made me reflect on how patristics and more broadly theology, especially kind of systematic theology, can sit uncomfortably in the modern academy. And it seemed to me that, John, you were using kind of the term institution as a kind of a catch-all for things that are slipping through the cracks in some sort of postmodern applications to these texts. And I felt like a similar thing was happening with Andrew, just kind of highlighting and plumbing allegory, again, is a thing that kind of doesn't compute sometimes in the modern academy, that can, at its worst, maybe be kind of compared with the beating of the text with a hose and eliciting a confession. So I just invite, there's not really a question there actually, it just invite both or either of you to kind of reflect back on this kind of frictious relationship in the modern academy with our discipline.
Yeah, well, first of all, just a quick response. If you remember nothing of Maximus and everything of Billy Collins's poem, I'd be very happy. That's very pleasant, you know. Yeah, sort of the gaps that I think that there are certain, you know, iterations of postmodern literary theory that might be rather congenial to something like allegory, right? There is something very whimsical about it. I don't necessarily, I would not kind of want to spend my life with Derrida, for example, because, you know, I think Maximus is a whole lot more profitable to do so. But nevertheless, I think there can be some relationships there and some bridges that could be built, particularly as sort of we understand what I think is useful, and I didn't want to talk about, I didn't get to talk about this, but there is this the exegetical concept in early Christian interpretation. What's like theoprepes, right? What is God worthy, right? What is venerate? You know, and I think that hermeneutic of charity, like acting like these authors actually know something. You know, we give our favorite, you know, flavor of the week contemporary scholar such generosity. You know, why can't we give to these ancient authors the same thing as well? So since you didn't ask a very precise question, I didn't feel I need to give a very precise response, but I don't know if that's helpful at all to, you know.
Well, for me, I think you probably noticed that I'm kind of grappling with a couple of different things here, and something that I don't think is a coincidence is that Vatican II happened at about the same time postmodernism starts to become a thing, and I accept Vatican II quite well. I like it very much, but I think there's a trade-off in putting the institutional model last, and it reflects both a trend to see institutions in terms of power but also how people, like in the academic institution, view historical texts in relation to power dynamics, and looking at how power shapes discourse, which I think gets us away from thinking about the kinds of theological ideas with which our writers were engaged. And I don't think our ancient writers would say, well, we're doing allegory so that we can subvert culture. I think it almost arose somewhat naturally by some of the assumptions that they were dealing with, particularly the assumptions that revolve around what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to be baptized. And something I had to skip over in my paper was that Origen alludes in his first homily in Psalm 77 to Romans, 6:4, because the verse in the Psalm reads, if I can find it real quick, the verse in the Psalm says, and they will rise up, so the sons of the fathers will rise up, and they will proclaim to their sons who are to be born. And Origen combines this with Romans 6:4, and he says that the people that are to be born in the Psalm are us who have been buried with Christ through baptism and will rise together with him. And if we connect this with the preparation for the Passion for Easter, we start to see some eschatological a prioris that Origen is dealing with here. To be baptized creates a new kind of existence. It's order out of chaos. And this is where probably my, I'm not a systematician. I do mostly history. So I'm really struggling to put this together. But I think we miss these things when we focus on power dynamics. And I think that has a direct bearing on what's happening in institutions today, that they're eroding all around us. And part of me can't help but think that that's because there's not a common foundation. There's not a common, starting point. There's nothing to ground us. And I think if we can start to think about institutions as being formative and look at how the early Christians were formed by their institutions, helps us think about how our institutions can form us, not just theologically, but ethically. I was going to bring up Origen's doctrine of, or his use of the Stoic oikeiosis in here to talk about some of the implications for Christian social ethics, but I just didn't have time. And that's kind of where I've been with this thing. And I have no idea where it's going to go because this is so new. I've spent so much of my time obsessed with the Caesarean school, more analogous to what my original paper probably would have sounded more like Robert's. But I've been thinking about kind of something else. So.
Thank you. Sid.
Hi, thanks for all of your papers. This question is for Robert. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like in the last decade or so, I just feel like there's like a move to rehabilitate the heretics, right? And so there's this move of saying that instead of saying heresy, we use heterodoxy, right? And so and I guess like my question is this some sort of this move from moving from Antiochene to Theodoran? Is it a political act in the sense of, for example, like I do my work in the Donatist controversy, and so through the literature, it's usually Catholics versus Donatists or whatever, and then later on there's a move to say, the Cecilianists versus the Donatists, because to say that it's all the Catholics might not really encompass what that meant at that particular time. And so a Cecilianist term would be more appropriate or something like that. And so is this more sort of like trying to bring like more precision in terms of the language that we use about this particular topic? And if that is the case, how does that affect our understanding of the Antiochene school, if we're going to, is this like a little mini branch of the Antiochene school? So yeah, I'd just be interested in, hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah, on the, I guess it is a sort of political move in the sense that you're right, there's been a lot of work, especially to sort of rehabilitate Theodore. I'm not necessarily trying to rehabilitate Theodore. I just want to be able to speak with more precision about what Theodore is doing and those who are following him, with what John Chrysostom is doing and those who are following him, etc. So it is certainly an attempt to be more precise. In terms of, I don't think that I don't think that geographical terms are terribly helpful in this case, because I mean, someone in the chat asked about John Cashin, and you know, it's a great question about John Cashin, because he was, you know, ordained deacon by John Chrysostom. He also spent lots of time in the Egyptian desert. So what is he? Is he Egyptian or Alexandrian, or is he Antiochian? But the geographical epithets, I just don't think do justice to well, to whatever these movements are. I think it makes more sense when we think about texts and receiving texts, because texts can move all across the Mediterranean and into the Near East. And so I don't think that a Theodoran school or whatever is a subset of Antiochene, because if we want to start talking about subsets of Antiochene, then we're talking about, you know, dozens of different sort of theological and exegetical communities, which actually span a larger geographical, which have a larger geographical span than just Alexandria, whether the city or the diocese. So I'm not sure if that really answered your question, but just some rambling thoughts that I have on recategorizing at the moment.
All right, thank you. I know we've gone over, but on the other hand, we're the last ones. So like, what does it even mean to go over? As long as we're all here enjoying conversation, right? Talking about institutions and Antiochs and all that other stuff. I'll just kind of throw out, since as the moderator, I feel like I should at least throw out something. And I will say the School of Antioch is even more confusing when you start talking about like the giant non-Nicene presence in Antioch at this time. Even going back to like Lucian of Antioch, is that a school-ish? Is when Theodora according to Theodora, takes over the flock in Antioch to kind of rally them against the non-Nicene dominant presence there. Is that a school, or is that more just a rallying of the troops going on? And is that lasting longer than just the Nicene controversy, or is that kind of establishing a school and, you know, all that other stuff? So just kind of throwing out more confusion to the confusion pie that we're cooking here. John.
Well, I think when we talk about schools, you know, I'm kind of harking back to Peter's comment at the very beginning. We talking about, what do we mean? Do we mean a fixed institution, a building, or do we mean a school of thought? And I'm curious, because in my own work on Caesarea, and Peter, you could probably talk more about this than I can, but I've asked quite a few questions about what we know about the location, like, you know, where they met, the material infrastructure, the social infrastructure. So who was there, how many people, what was their daily life? Have you looked at that at all? I mean, are there any archaeological remains that can shed some material, empirical light on what's going on in Antioch?
Sadly, there are very limited archaeological remains of any churches in Antioch. Like we have mosaics from several in Antioch in the region, but it's an earthquake-prone region.
Got some good questions happening over there.
Hey, thanks a lot, Don. You just cut Robert right off. I don't know, you know, who do you